Just over 10 years ago, Valve released its very first Steam machine based on a Linux operating system. It was a worthy endeavor. It was an attempt to challenge Windows. And ultimately, though, it didn't particularly succeed owing to the lack of Linux support in gaming. 10 years on, obviously, with Steam Deck and the Proton compatibility layer, everything has changed. And wow, Valve has just introduced its brand new Steam machine, which looks very, very exciting. Going to be talking to Oliver Mackenzie, who went to visit Valve, and of course, Alex Battaglia. But first, this. The big holiday discount season is upon us, with MSI bringing some of its biggest savings ever. Check out discounts on MSI displays, including critically acclaimed QD OLEDs like the MPG 272 URX and the MPG 321 URXW. But there's more. Grab up to $100 off MSI graphics cards and up to $150 off MSI motherboards, cases, and coolers while stocks last. Click on the link in the video description below for more details. Okay then, so Oliver, you visited Valve, you've seen the Steam machine. Where do you want to begin?
Yeah, I did. I was there about a week and a half ago to take a look at the new Steam machine and also the Steam controller, which is their new accompanying controller for the Steam machine, as well as standalone devices. So the basic premise here that Valve pitched to me with the Steam machine is that people are using their Steam Decks when connected to a TV, and that can be a very good experience. You know, John has talked a lot about his experiences using a Steam Deck on a TV. It can be very smooth, but the Steam Deck is not very powerful, or at least not very powerful in the context of console gaming or PC gaming. Really, it's a handheld, right? It's a power device. So in comes the Steam machine. It's a little box. You can see how small it is in my B-roll here. I don't have exact sizing on it, but it's definitely smaller than a Series X. It kind of feels like a Series X with a chunk chopped off and turned on its side, right? So the exhaust is facing the rear, that kind of thing. It runs SteamOS, and it feels very smooth and stable, just like Steam Deck. It's a very quiet and subtle little system that's designed to be used as a console or in a console-like form. That's the key here. Now, it can be used with a mouse and keyboard. It can be used with multiple displays. It has all that configurability. If you want to use it, you can use it with the Linux desktop. You can do all kinds of things with it. It's a very configurable and extensible device, but it's oriented towards a console experience. That's the key takeaway in terms of form factor and use here. So to me, this is like a bit of a validation of a thought that I've had ever since the Steam Deck was released, which is like, wouldn't this be great in a console box? That's exactly what they've done with the Steam machine, basically. So it runs, you know, if you're not familiar with SteamOS, if you're not familiar with Steam Deck, I'm sure you are, but it basically runs PC software in a kind of padded room where it's hard to hurt yourself. They try to sand off as many edges as possible.
That's awesome.
So it's like taking this thing that historically has not meshed well with a home console, home theater experience, and making it work within that context by using a mix of software accommodations and the hardware accommodations, which I'm sure we'll talk about shortly. But yeah, that's the general outline of this system. In broad strokes, that's what it is.
Wow. Alex, what do you make of that?
Well, I mean, I think this is something that we'd been talking about for a long time. We imagined Valve would be pushing in this direction after they started working on the Steam Deck and bringing that out. We thought it would make sense to bring a higher performance console-like experience out. And this is leveraging all their work on Linux, DXVK, Proton, everything that's been happening the last essentially 4 or 5 years at this point at Valve, and it makes a lot of sense to me. And it's interesting to see that the hardware spec that they chose here, which we're going to be talking about in the course of this video, as it's as I think landing at a right price point with the right level of power, with the right set of features, is going to be like the winning combination here. And yeah, we'll be talking about that.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's talk about the hardware, because in a sense, it is essentially a custom PC. It's literally built from the ground up with a very specific design target in mind. And also, I'd say relatively modest specifications, but obviously everything is relative, right? We don't really know what the price point is at the moment. I guess we can talk about that a bit later on. But Oliver, they actually showed you around the essential architecture, the building blocks of this machine. And man, that's a big heatsink and cooling assembly there.
It is a really big heatsink and cooling assembly. I'll touch on that in a moment. It's quite a unique thermal design, as I'm sure you'll see. But basically, in terms of that broad spec, starting with storage, It ships with a 2230 SSD of either a 512 gigabyte or 2 terabyte capacity. It's an M.2 SSD. It can fit a 2280 SSD, though there is space for that, and it's easily upgradable. And then there's also an SD slot. It's not an SD Express, so it's standard micro SD XC. I asked about this, and in their experience, they said it works pretty well, but obviously that's going to have a pretty large speed penalty relative to the internal storage. So I'd imagine, based off of Steam Deck testing, you'd probably want to install demanding games to the SSD. But if you do have a Steam Deck, this is a cool feature they highlighted several times to me. If you do have a Steam Deck, or indeed a Steam frame, which we'll talk about in a separate video, you can take your micro SD card, unplug it from that device, plug it into another device, and get those games running on it, right? So it's a very easy hot swap kind of system there if you do have multiple games on an SD card. So in terms of the actual like meaty part of the specification, this is the interesting part. So the CPU is a 6-core AMD Zen 4 design at up to 4.8 gigahertz, they're quoting here. It only consumes about 30 watts, according to their spec sheet and according to a Valve employee I talked to. And other leaks have suggested it's based on a Hawk Point, potentially. That is a mobile APU that's similar to the AMD Z1 products. Those are based on the Phoenix silicon. This is like a slight evolution or refresh of that silicon. Potentially. Again, potentially, they didn't confirm that to me. I'm not too worried about this part of the spec, given that we're targeting TVs, generally 60 FPS, that kind of thing. I think it should be capable of that in most titles. I don't think you're going to have huge issues with that part. I think it's probably going to be okay, at least relative to the other parts of the spec, which may pose more problems. It has 16 gigabytes of DDR5. That is in a SO-DIMM configuration, so basically laptop parts here. And that is user replaceable, but you have to take apart the unit some ways to get there. So not as easy as the SSD. On the GPU side of things, this is where it gets a little more interesting and possibly a little bit more controversial. So the GPU is RDNA 3 based, not RDNA 4, and it has 28 CUs at up to 2.45 gigahertz sustained clocks. So if we look in the AMD parts bin as to what that likely is, it's probably Navi 33, which is the same die that's an RX 7600. That chip, though, has 32 CUs. So this would be cut down slightly from that 32 CU allocation to 28 CUs. Valve says it's semi-custom. I assume the semi-custom means off-the-shelf part, new configuration, right? That's usually what that means. So in this context, it's not actually a very new part, I would think. It has only 8 gigabytes of GDDR6 memory. And if you think about the memory configuration there, it's probably a 128-bit bus, which would be no surprise because that's the maximum memory bus configuration in the Navi 33 product. I did submit some more detailed questions about the memory bus and things like that, but I did not get a response back in time for the recording or publication of this video. So this is a bit tricky on the GPU side. And I really want to hear what Alex thinks about this. And obviously Rich, but the GPU here is not that crazy. The RX 7600 is in the mix with cards like the RTX 4060 in rasterization and considerably behind that in ray tracing, and this is obviously weaker than that. And they're saying this is a 4K 60 box with FSR. Now, that's really going to depend on the game, is my feeling on that. We can talk about that a bit, but like I did play Cyberpunk on it in a few scenarios, and they were saying it would run at 4K 60, maybe 50 to 60 FPS, some variability there. And I was able to get it running at 1440p 60 with upscaling fairly easily. And I turned on the ray traced sun shadows and RT reflections, and it was dropping to something like the 30 FPS range. It was a little bit jittery though, because the TV they were demoing it on did not support VRR, which I thought was an interesting choice. So that was a little bit unpleasant. It's definitely going to be 4K 60 for some games with FSR, but like saying that as a blanket statement, I don't think that's going to be true. If we look at the current gen consoles, oftentimes they're 1440p 60 boxes, right? Or 4K 30 boxes with similar kinds of upscaling. They said the GPU pulls about 110 to 130 watts. In the spec sheet, it says 110, but they quoted up to 130 to me. And the overall system should have a power draw of about 200 watts under load, according to an engineer that I spoke to. But I mean, the more critical aspect, and again, I'd be interested to hear your feedback on this, is the 8 gigabytes of VRAM, because maybe that's not enough for modern games, and in a world where console titles can use like 10 gigabytes of VRAM fairly easily. I did ask a Valve engineer about this, and he said that 8 gigabytes is sufficient from their testing for their purposes for most games. And they wanted to emphasize affordability for the box itself. So yeah, I think there are two issues here. Number one, the GPU is like a little bit anemic, perhaps, especially relative to current gen console spec, which it's trailing slightly, I would say. And then the 8 gigabytes of VRAM poses more possibly fundamental limits depending on the game, like we've seen in games like Indiana Jones.
Yeah. So I fully concur with what Oliver says is when you look at the spec sheet, I see a Zen 4 CPU, even with less cache. We've seen Zen 4 do quite well, especially when clocked up like this potentially can be. And I feel like that's actually one of the best parts of this device. You're getting a CPU that will last for a good amount of time and will be very capable. But then you get to the GPU, and there's nothing wrong with the device having a lower powered and less bandwidth GPU at all if you keep it within like constrained resolution and constrained settings. But then it kind of conflicts slightly with the nature of the box itself being described as 4K 60 capable, and also occupying the space in the living room with a no-fuss console-like experience. And I don't want to say this is 100% the exact same thing as a console, and I don't think Valve would say that either, because they are leveraging PC technology. They are leveraging the fact that you load up PC games with like settings in them. But at the same time, as you throw in a GPU of that, I would say performance level, and then tack on 8 gigs of VRAM into it, what it necessitates from many users, and that's why I make videos at all, is that you have to then go into the option settings and start changing things. And as soon as you start doing that, it becomes a less straightforward device and a less straightforward experience. And I think that is the largest conflict for me. And the big contenders really are going to be modern AAA games that were designed around the consoles, which have access to more video memory in general than what this device has. And the things that can do to the player experience are generally very negative. Turning down something like lighting to medium quality is not that big of a deal usually, but turning down texture quality and or overgoing texture budget with VRAM means either a very, very blurry texture experience at times, or a very stuttery experience, or a performance, cliff experience where all of a sudden you get to some point in the game and it runs at 10 FPS for like 15 seconds until it purges things that were in VRAM that shouldn't have been there. And right. Those are things that I would want to avoid as much as possible if I were designing a box, trying to be as user-friendly as possible. But I think that's what the interview that Oliver had with that one engineer described, that this is an affordability concern, which is something we've both heard from AMD and NVIDIA in the past. It's kind of how they've kind of justified the whole, that's why we put out an 8 gigabyte GPU. They've also justified it with gamers are playing at 1080p, something that I don't find nearly as plausible as a reason for it. Because you can still have VRAM limitation issues at 1080p. So I feel like that is the lowest and the most questionable part of this spec that I would be curious to see running in the wild, because they only showed you a certain set of games, Oliver. I would personally like to see myself, okay, what happens when I load up Monster Hunter on it? Like, does this run terribly? Can it even run Monster Hunter? That's using, direct storage and stuff like that. There's a lot of questions that I just don't have really great answers to right now, but I can imagine it right now in my setup, like right there, right where the Series X is. I just take that off, and I could use that as a foil to my PC gaming reviews, where I say like, oh, let's see how the Steam machine runs this. I could actually imagine myself doing that, because I kind of want to do that, because I like the fact that Valve is putting out a Linux desktop PC-like experience that's more curated, because I'm kind of fed up with Windows. So I think this is a very appealing device, even if it has hardware spec things that I'm a little bit concerned about right now.
From my perspective, from a sort of conceptual angle, this is kind of like almost a preview of what Microsoft is going to be attempting to be doing with whatever its next generation thing is, which is essentially it's built on a PC operating system, but it is heavily games focused, with a games orientated UI that you boot into, which I think is pretty great, which is proven to work on Steam Deck. And in this sense, Valve are way, way, way ahead of anything we've seen from Microsoft. So I really like the concept of having this PC, which is games focused, games first, and looks fantastic and looks console-like. I think this is a really, really cool looking device. Really interested in your impressions on the form factor in a bit, Oliver. But let's talk about the specifications, because it is fundamentally a PC, right? And I guess, there are two options here for the SKUs. You've got a 512 gigabyte SKU, which I'll tell you what, I've got a 512 gigabyte SSD in my ROG Ally, and I just run out of space all the time. It's really difficult to actually keep a good number of games on that. I think automatically you're going to be wanting the 2 terabyte SSD version. Yeah. And the other thing about having this concept of SKUs is that I do really wish that there was an 8 and 16 gigabyte VRAM version.
Yes, yeah, really.
Because, the RX 7600 comes in 8 gigabyte and 16 gigabyte variations. So, fundamentally it is possible. I think they could have done that. Obviously, it depends on what the makeup of the motherboard looks like for this specific device. But I don't suppose you saw the motherboard, did you, Oliver?
I did not. I saw it semi-naked, semi-disassembled, but not completely.
Okay.
Yeah.
CPU... don't have any problems at all with that, to be honest. It's going to be absolutely fine, I'd imagine. I mean, obviously, games where we've seen foundational problems with CPU utilization, it's going to be better than the Ryzen 5 3600, which you often show in your videos, Alex, but obviously nowhere near the 9800 X3D, which you also show in your videos. But ultimately, I think it's fine for a device where I think they're addressing a specific price point. Now, the GPU, I've been trying to sort of get in my head what we should be expecting from this, because it is fundamentally a cut down version of the RX 7600 desktop card, which, I think it was like $270 when it launched. It's okay. It's fine. Not fantastic. There are some cutbacks here. The TDP has been reduced. The CU count, obviously, 28 versus 32. So, yeah, I mean, there aren't any 28 CU RDNA 3 consumer gaming parts to actually compare to. If you go back to the RX 6600 RDNA 2, that is 28 CUs, and it's significantly slower than the 7600. I've got some benchmarks here. I don't want it to be taken as this is what the frame rates of the Steam machine are going to be. That's not the case. It's basically relative performance under identical workloads between this range of GPUs, right? And I kind of suspect that we're going to be looking at some midpoint between the RX 6600 and the RX 7600 based on those benchmarks there.
Right.
And I've also included RTX 3060 and 4060 so you can get an idea of where it sits in NVIDIA land. I think that's okay. I think, the concept of it running 4K 60, I think it was, let's be clear, I think they were saying it's 4K 60 with FSR. That was... with upscaling, which is, that can be as wide as you like. It could be like native 720p up to 4K with ultra performance mode, which you wouldn't want to do. I think 1080p is with upscaling on challenging titles is going to be probably what this machine is best suited for, and optimized settings. Obviously, these benchmarks, the nature of PC benchmarking is typically you ramp everything up to ultra, and as we've seen, especially with Unreal Engine 5, that is a fool's errand. You should not be doing that. I think it's all going to come down to price, because, if this is a $399 box, that very, very much excites me. If we're talking about comparisons to consoles and they're rolling up with a $499 price point, I find that problematic. And who knows what's going to be happening with those two storage SKUs in terms of pricing as well. $500 kind of takes you into PlayStation 5 territory. Obviously, they're different machines fundamentally in terms of one has a foundational PC basis, but, this is a console play as well. And I'd say in terms of where you're going to sit this device, it's at some midpoint between Xbox Series S and PlayStation 5, probably closer to the PlayStation 5 side of things. But certainly the PS5 probably will have better performance overall. Just
Yeah.
need to wait and see. I guess this will be using Steam. Well, it is using SteamOS, therefore it's using the RAD-V driver. So there's going to be some interesting comparison points to running this on Windows, because in some aspects, RAD-V can be much faster than Windows, believe it or not. So yeah, there's a bit of a grey area in terms of performance, but I personally wouldn't have been saying this is a 4K machine even with upscaling. I think you've got to be on a much higher performance tier at this point with today's AAA games for sure. There's actually something you got to say about saying any piece of hardware is specifically tied to a specific resolution target, because the nature of games is such that the scalability within them, and of course their baseline performance requirement, radically changes from game to game, which basically means that, more challenging titles will need a higher performing GPU to get to that resolution target. So yeah, I don't think you should have been saying this is a 4K machine, because that was a claim that has backfired spectacularly for going back to Xbox One X, which, this is a 4K machine, and it's like, well, yeah, and no. So yeah, interesting stuff there. 16 gigs of SODIMM memory, that's fine, right? I mean, 24 gigs in total. I mean, that is going to be, I suspect, quite expensive for them to produce, especially in the current climate of escalating memory prices. I think this spec is fine. I do wish there was a 16 gig memory alternative there. And 8 gigs, well, everything will run, right? It's just a question of how well it will run and how bad some of those textures are going to look. I mean, I'm just thinking of Stellar Blade in particular. That was the last game I looked at where, it needed to be run at medium settings, and the difference between medium settings and highs, and indeed PlayStation 5 was huge. It does have a fundamental impact on the game. That said, I can fully understand the price sensitivity nature of it. And that's exactly the same rationale that both AMD and NVIDIA have come up with for, the 5060 class cards out there at the moment. And the 9060, of course, that's also available in an 8 gig configuration. Oliver, where do you want to go from here? I mean, you've obviously been hands-on. Essentially, it played as you would expect for that level of hardware, right?
Yeah, it basically behaved as I would expect. Actually, the games that I took a look at, it was a pretty small number because of how pressed I was for time. Because like the various presentations, I'd have like 40 minutes to do a presentation or 50 minutes to do a presentation. But of that, I had to squeeze in like a 20-minute interview, right? Like 25-minute interview. Right. So I was really just looking at like the game they had sketched out for me, which in this case was Cyberpunk, testing it at a couple different settings, and largely seeing that was okay. Now, there were some issues at various points with Cyberpunk running on the different demo machines. At one point, the game seemed locked to 30 FPS. At other points, it seemed, problematic in other ways. It's clearly like I didn't want to put too much emphasis on the initial performance of the device because I was looking at purely software, purely hardware. Who knows what will happen? But there are some other capabilities of the hardware that I think are kind of interesting here, touching on some of these features that we've discussed before. It is a ray tracing capable device, obviously, and that's very necessary for current games. And we know SteamOS does support ray tracing. I spoke to Pierre-Luc Griffet about this, and he said the RT performance of the Steam Machine hardware should be good because they worked heavily on the driver for it. So they introduced a kind of experimental RT support in SteamOS about a year. I think it was about a year and a half, or maybe it was 2 years ago.
Yeah.
But they do expect to be at full performance by the time Steam Machine is on sale. So I presume that means full performance relative to the hardware running, Windows or similar hardware running Windows, right? The hardware supports FSR 2 and 3, obviously, but not FSR 4 at this junction. I spoke to Valve about that. They said they're in discussions with AMD about that, but they don't have anything to talk about, nor any particularly new information for us. But if they can support FSR on Steam Machine, they said they will do it. So that's a potential. Again, if we do see that, in-date version ported to RDNA 3, as we think might be the case in the future. Perhaps we'll see that on Steam Machine as well, which would be quite nice. So in terms of connectivity, just rounding out the spec sheet here, it has 5 USB ports, 4 USB-A, 2 of which are 3.0, 2 of which are 2.0, and 1 USB-C, I think a 3.2 port, 10 gigabits per second port, which is quite nice. It has an Ethernet port. It has Wi-Fi 6E. For Bluetooth, this is interesting. They really wanted to highlight this to me. It has a separate Bluetooth antenna for controller connectivity. So instead of splitting the Wi-Fi antenna, they've actually got a separate Bluetooth antenna, and it can support up to 4 controllers connected at once. So that's quite nice functionality, I think. Now, in terms of display out, this is going to be controversial. The way that Valve has laid this out in some of the specs that I've seen is slightly worrying, but in practice, it's actually not as worrying. So it supports DisplayPort 1.4 output. It has a DisplayPort 1.4 port. It also has what they're calling an HDMI 2.0 port. But when I spoke to them, it's more complicated than that. The hardware itself is HDMI 2.1 capable. They stressed that to me. And it supports VRR and HDR. It also supports 4K 120 output, but it doesn't currently support modes that require DSC, like 4K 165, right? Which you will see on some TVs nowadays, many monitors. So it should be fine for most users. I don't think most users are expecting that or need that functionality. They are working on those higher refresh rates, but they wouldn't commit to anything for launch. So at launch, it'll be a 4K 120 device, I suspect, off that HDMI port. But it also supports HDMI CEC, so you can get that nice home theater control if you want that. I always turn that off on my machines, but if that's something you're into.
It causes issues for me always.
Yeah, if that's something you're into, it does support that. And DisplayPort 1.4 is fully supported, so they're talking on the spec sheet about 4K 240 just fine over DP, so that should be terrific. And you can do multiple monitors, so you can do DisplayPort and HDMI at the same time, or HDMI and DisplayPort daisy-chained to multiple monitors at the same time. So that's quite nice for kind of PC functionality. The hardware has some other nice features. Now, I didn't talk about it, but the front faceplate of the device is actually removable. It has magnets and it's removable. So they said that's primarily for cleaning of the device, if you do want to clean it. And those faceplates are fully customizable, and they talked about different kinds they might offer. They had one with kind of a wood grain finish. They also had one with an e-ink display that was custom. I don't think they'll be selling that one, but it looked really cool. It had some various stats about the device. That's cool. It also has an LED light strip underneath the front facade. And they mentioned one functionality is that if you're downloading a game, that could show the progress of the game download as it's being downloaded.
Oh, that'd be sick.
Which is really cool, I think. And they're going to be releasing 3D CAD files for those so you can make your own. Now, probably most interesting about this whole discussion, and I'll wrap with this, is that thermally, the whole device, it's just this large exhaust fan that they designed the system around, that occupies most of the back facade of the unit, right? It's a nice big circular fan. I think bigger than any console fan I've seen, bigger than a Series X fan, I think, in terms of its diameter. And between that fan and the faceplate, there's this huge aluminum heatsink with copper heat pipes. Again, this is a 200-watt device. So it's dissipating as much as a PlayStation 5 or a Series X, but in a smaller form factor. So that's really key here. They told me they purposely put the display outputs and all the ports in the back of the device so that in typical use, they're very hard to block because you'll have cable sticking out of it. So the exhaust is going to blow into open air, at least a few inches of open air is the idea. So they really designed this thing like more than anything else, more than any other device I've ever seen, because there have been console-like PC devices in the past. We've had major OEMs like Alienware offering, these kind of PC-like, console-like boxes. But Valve has really thought through every element of this device, from hardware, software, OS, everything, controller, which we'll talk about, everything they've thought about to try to make this work really well as a cut price living room device. And I think that's really cool. They've put a ton of effort into it, a ton of time into it, and it oozes thought and quality at every corner. And I was just really impressed with the overall hardware of this device and the software, obviously.
Yeah, it looks irresistible. It's really, really cute, doesn't it?
It's very nice looking, admittedly. Yeah. A lot better looking than the base PS1, for example. Or PS5, sorry, not PS1. PS1's great, actually, looking. PS5, though, that's a whole nother story.
I just want to go back quickly to the FSR4 stuff because we've got it running on Steam Deck using the leaked Int 8 DLL So the concept of actual FSR4 running on SteamOS, possibly not as onerous as it sounds. And it should, you'd kind of hope that it would just kind of work. I guess it does need to have some level of driver support in there, however. But I think that would be pretty good for this device. And it is kind of tailored for RDNA 3 upwards from on the 8 side, at least. So I'm quite optimistic that that is going to happen. And I think that would be of specific value to this device, bearing in mind the level of GPU that we're dealing with. But should we move on now? Because obviously part of the package is the new controller, right? And this is quite different from the initial Steam Machines controller, the initial Steam controller that we had back in 2015, which was very, very different to a standard joypad.
Yeah, that initial Steam Machine controller, that initial Steam controller is kind of an alien-looking device, because in the portions where you normally have 2 thumbsticks, you have dual D-pads / touchpads, right?
Yeah.
And you don't actually have a formal D-pad, nor do you have a second analog stick. So you're basically being asked to use one of these touchpads for camera control in 3D games. And I have used one of these devices before. I don't have one here on hand, but I have used one. And I will say it's very awkward. It's very awkward. It's a weird feeling. This actually feels like an evolution, right? It's been 10 years since that device launched. It's an evolution of that, but it's so better in so many ways, and it takes so many learnings from the Steam Deck itself to actually make a really good controller for PC and kind of console controller games on the PC. So it has all the controls you'd expect, plus dual trackpads below the sticks, a dedicated Steam button, a Steam Quick Action menu button, and 4 back buttons. It feels very much like the Steam Deck, except that the ergonomics of the device are very different. It's kind of sculpted to fit your hand instead of being flat like the Steam Deck is. It's like the dual trackpads, for instance, are canted slightly inwards to give your thumbs a more comfortable place to rest. And it feels very, very good in the hand. And also the buttons feel slightly different in some ways. The sticks feel fairly similar. The face buttons feel very similar. The triggers have a bit more of a pull to them, I would say. And the top trigger buttons, the kind of RB, LB equivalents, those have a mushier actuation instead of the clicky, snappy actuation on the Steam Deck. It has gyro controls, as you might expect. Again, more Steam Deck functionality. It has magnetic thumbsticks using a technology called TMR that they're saying is an evolution over Hall Effect. So presumably, similar to Hall Effect, if not better. And it should have impacts on durability, right? A better actuation of the stick over its lifetime, better potentiometer, right? Or other technologies there. It has a feature called Grip Sense, which is really cool, where the controller can sense if you're gripping the unit or if your fingers are off the back of the unit using capacitive sensors, which can be used as an additional modifier or input. So the example of the functionality they showed me, and I have a demo running here of myself using this functionality, is disabling gyro aiming when you aren't gripping the controller. So you can reposition your arms without having to recenter your aim by lifting your fingers off the back of the controller. And they were showing it to me in the game Balatro, right? Which normally has quite good controller support, but in this case, they were showing me the ability to use the trackpads as an input, as a kind of replacement for mouse functionality in this game, or indeed the gyro, to move the cards around, which I thought was kind of interesting. Those are unique functionalities you're going to get on this controller using those new input methods. It has haptic feedback on the trackpads, just like Steam Deck. It also has haptic motors in the controller itself. They're quoting kind of HD rumble functionality. It feels very good, feels very responsive, much stronger than the Steam Deck, which is quite weak. So yeah, it feels great. In terms of connectivity, it connects via a Steam controller puck, which is this little dongle that can also connect to the controller magnetically to charge it. It also has a USB Type-C port in it, by the way, if you want to charge it using that. And it has a wireless connection they say should be rock solid. It uses a proprietary wireless standard. But you can connect it via Bluetooth or wired instead if you want to. And the Steam machine itself comes with a Steam controller, and it can be powered on using the Steam controller directly with a hit of the Steam button, right? That's functionality you see on other consoles. It's functionality we're going to see here, at least if you're using that Steam controller. So my feelings on this, I think this is way better than that OG Steam controller. This is definitely going to be great for times when you're gaming and you need mouse input, right? So you need to navigate errant controller elements, like we often see in PC games using SteamOS, because on Steam Deck, you have this nice dual functionality of being able to use the touchpad or the touchscreen or the trackpads, right? So here we're getting some of that functionality with the trackpads. We have that ability to navigate those interfaces. They also will have a Steam Machine verified program they talked to me about that will apply basically to the combination of a Steam Machine plus Steam controller. So they're not going to have a verified program for a generic controller, but they think they can have a verified program that will work well for the Steam Machine plus the Steam controller. I also think this is going to be an amazing device for traditional PC games, or at least games that can be adapted to some degree. And the one that comes to mind for me is World of Warcraft, because if you install certain mods, you can actually play the game really effectively with the controller, but sometimes you do need cursor input. And up until now, I've been using a DualShock 4 for that. This seems like a much better device for that, with its back buttons, with its great trackpads, with everything. So yeah, I think this is really cool. I think it's going to be a great Windows controller as well, because you have that ability to navigate all those cumbersome interface elements that previously you'd have no good way to navigate or use. In this controller, you do have that functionality. So I think it's a really cool controller. I think people are really going to like it. I really like it. I'm really into it. But it does seem, and this is a kind of recurring theme with this device, that they make a lot of specific accommodations and adjustments to make this controller good in the context of an operating system that might, God forbid, present you with a window at some point, and you have to navigate it. And this is making that experience a lot better, a lot more usable.
Fantastic stuff. Any thoughts there, Alex?
No, I'm just actually impressed by Valve's ability to make an ecosystem ahead of other people like Microsoft. The idea of turning on my PC, waking it with like the touch of the Xbox button is so foreign because it's impossible, I'm pretty sure. Maybe not. Maybe there's a wake from USB function. I'm not sure if that can allow me to do that. But yeah, I like those ideas. I'm also very interested in the not mentioned from Oliver, but since we're talking about SteamOS here, the ability to sleep games. Yep. They just brought out the new download function for the Steam Deck, which goes low wattage mode. It'd be really interesting to see if the OS is capable of doing that as well on this device, where you just kind of like let it download a bunch of games in a low powered state. There's a lot of stuff that they've been doing already in their ecosystem that really interests me. The controller, I play mainly with mouse and keyboard, so I have less of an interest there. But in regards to the ecosystem stuff, I'm very interested. I'm also interested in the places where they can go beyond what AMD allows. Like for their, you were just talking about the difference between RAD-V performance potentially and like driver compiler optimizations, which is something that we've seen in the past and we've heard reports on. And I'm also curious about, I don't know if they would, but things like Optiscaler run on DLSS and XeSS DLLs, and they inject FSR4 into games where even FSR could not have been in the game at all, or they only had older versions, pre-DLL versions of FSR. And, nothing's really technically stopping Valve from doing that, but at the worst, the community steps in. But I would really like to see this box be one where there needs to be less community injection to make it better in areas, and rather more Valve takes control, not control, but offers more of that stuff that the community also does. Because if this is supposed to be a move into the console-like environment, it would be great if it required the least amount of extra work from the user as possible to make that just make more sense for what the box is trying to be. But as a PC user, I'm just very interested in it. I'm a little bit worried about the VRAM, but we'll have to see how that shakes out depending upon the price.
Yeah, I think from the VRAM side of things, and again, this is another argument that both AMD and NVIDIA have come up with, it's essentially that PC gaming is a lot larger than our particular focus, and a huge amount of games that don't really touch VRAM are actually getting a lot of use, within the PC ecosystem. It is just from our perspective, when you're looking at AAA, when you're looking at future titles, that it has been proven to be a concern to the point where you've essentially seen a scaling up of GPU compute to the point where it is now being held back by the fact that sometimes there's not the memory enough to feed it, particularly with ray tracing, which is probably a slightly less of a concern for this particular level of GPU, but there it is. But ultimately, I think it's still a kind of halfway house between console and PC, which I think has strengths and weaknesses. On the strengths side of things, that, going back to the modding stuff, the fact is that there is a huge amount of stuff out there that you can do with this device that you won't be able to do with a console. And, when you think about the Steam Deck, all of the plugins that are available for it, plugins that did make the FSR4 preview happen, for example, on Steam Deck. I mean, this is all really, really exciting stuff that users can tap into. But at the same time, on the flip side, the fact that there isn't the sort of full-on hand-holding that Sony and Microsoft do does mean that there's a very good chance that you'll be downloading games and kind of like flailing around in the dark to get the best possible settings for this. In which case, I guess, Alex, they should be considering your entire library of optimized settings videos at this point.
Why not?
Which typically do address 8 gigabyte VRAM limits.
Usually do, yes.
Would usually do. And of course, I mean, I know what's going to be happening with review units. Indiana Jones is going to be printed right off the bat to see just how that 8 gigabyte VRAM limit is being handled there. I'm interested in your closing thoughts, Oliver, not just about the hardware, but also about the actual visit to Valve itself. I mean, I've been on a Valve press tour, but I've never been in Valve HQ, so this has been pretty exciting.
Yeah, it was really cool. They brought me up along with Andrew Elmore, who helped us with this visit, by the way, and filmed a lot of this footage that you're seeing on screen right now. And they took us in. They had it kind of us cordoned off in this like press area where there were some guards and some curtains in the areas that were inaccessible to us, which is kind of nice because sometimes in these visits, you'll have a minder who follows you everywhere. But in this visit, I could freely like go to the bathroom on my own without needing someone to mind me to make sure that I'm not going somewhere that I shouldn't be, which is very important, obviously. And basically what they had us do is they sat us through an introduction, and then they brought us to the Steam Machine and Steam Controller exhibition where they had a little demo, interviews. Then likewise with the Steam Frame device, which we'll talk about in a separate video that should be live hopefully a few hours after this one if I've done my job right. And they also brought us to a demo room where we had some time to sit around, hang around with some Valve engineers, some Valve software developers, and play with these different devices and look at some different devices like the e-ink Steam Machine, which I thought was quite cool. So yeah, it was a really fun visit. We were there for about 4 hours or so, 3 hours maybe like. And it was just it was a fun time, and I really enjoyed myself there looking at all this hardware, which I think was quite exciting. When I walked in, I didn't expect necessarily all 3 of these devices. I expected the headset, right? I wasn't sure about the other ones. I was hoping the other ones would be there, half expecting they would be there, but, lo and behold, everything was there, except perhaps for HLX, aka Half-Life 3.
Yeah. That's
one title that Rich suggested to me might be there. And I was personally thinking, who knows? But obviously that's not in the cards in the moment. We do expect that's in development. We do expect that will be released at some point soon, at least based off of third-party leaks. I have no particular insight into this myself, but we did not see that product at all. So in terms of, I want to touch on one quick thing, is that in terms of kind of other issues you might have with SteamOS, this device, relative to other devices that might be out there, one thing and one kind of continuing issue on SteamOS these days is the proliferation of kernel-level anti-cheat in multiplayer titles. Valve has worked with some developers who use kernel-level anti-cheat to remove that functionality for their games on Steam Deck, on SteamOS, but it really does require cooperation from the developers. So titles like Battlefield 6, they're not going to run on this thing flat out. Like without some kind of workaround for this kernel level anti-cheat or a different accommodation for Linux devices, that's just not going to happen right on this device. So that's a potential issue. And in general, when I go through my Steam library, I would say about 20%, maybe 20%, maybe 15% of those titles do not currently work on Steam Deck, like flat out do not work or have some great functionality issue. So I would say that like with this device, again, another issue relative to that console experience is not every game you download, not every game you own is going to run on this thing, right? Whereas with a Windows device, you'd have a greater understanding that it could probably run just about anything you wanted to throw on it.
Yeah.
Right? That is a level of flexibility you're not going to get on this device, but it should run, they do have a good Steam Deck verified program. They'll have a good Steam Machine verified program. At least going forward, you'll be able to see what games will run and what games won't, right? But overall, I think these are really cool devices. On the Steam Machine front, I'm so glad that Valve is innovating this console-like product in this category. It has some obvious compromises, namely in terms of spec, but it works better as a console than any PC device I've ever used. And this is interesting. So Pierre-Luc Griffet, one of the senior software architects behind SteamOS, mentioned to me in the future that we may see third-party SteamOS boxes like the Steam Machine from different vendors with different AMD hardware inside. So they're maybe interested in like the Steam Deck model, where they pioneer the category, and then later on we see third-party SteamOS devices, in that case in handhelds, in this case in these kind of console-like boxes. So maybe you could see a higher performance model down the line. Who knows? Maybe we're looking at an ecosystem of devices where in a few years we see a whole stack of products from Valve and third-party OEMs with the Steam Machine branding. That would be very cool, I think. And one final issue here that I haven't mentioned so far because it didn't really fit in any other section is the media playback situation. So obviously people use these devices very frequently for like Netflix, Amazon Prime, Apple TV, what have you. This device does not have any native media streaming apps of these kinds. Instead, you access those functionalities through the web browser. And the web browser does have HDR functionality. You can view HDR content through it, they said. But if you do want to go that route, it might be a little bit painful. So media streaming, if media streaming is important to you, if you don't already have an Apple TV or an Xbox or a PlayStation or something else that can do media streaming fairly well, a Fire TV, this device is not going to fill that need for you in any realistically easy to use way, unfortunately. They're looking at including that functionality in the future, but so far that's MIA in the initial launch version. Mm-hmm. But I'm really encouraged by this. I think Valve is doing a great job kind of stewarding and offering an alternative device ecosystem for the future of PC gaming. And I think this will be a lot more successful than the first Steam Machine, a lot more successful than the first Steam controller. It's way better. It feels like this is the actual like iteration on the device that is going to catch fire, that is going to make people excited. It's so much better in every single area. The only real question mark, and again, you as the viewer will have the benefit of possibly knowing this information more than we will, but I don't know the specific release date, right? So they mentioned Q1 2026. They told me it was still up in the air as to whether they would launch all on the same date or on different dates. So there's the potential that we could see all the products launched on the same date. And the other big question mark, of course, which we've mentioned a few times, is price. I think the fact they're shipping a 512 gigabyte box maybe suggests they're aiming towards the lower end of that spectrum, because that is pretty stingy. But who knows, right? At this point, it's up in the air.
Yeah.
Right. I'd hope to see aggressive pricing similar to the original Steam Deck. And it actually makes a bit of a statement, even though a lot of people are actually opting for the higher specification SKUs anyway. Yeah, it's like starting from $399 for the original Steam Deck was really powerful, right? It's the number that sticks in people's minds. Similarly, when you were talking about the idea of OEMs producing their own Steam machines, I think that's just awesome, right? Because all of the fundamentals are seemingly here for a PC that you connect to a TV. And in theory, that RAD-V driver should essentially work with just about anything that AMD puts out.
Yeah.
So, happy days. It should be pretty fantastic, I think. And the opportunity there is very, very compelling, because, there are going to be high-end enthusiasts who want a device like this, but probably want more performance. And the idea that they can either buy one or they can roll their own and then just install the SteamOS operating system. Not only is it really great, it's also sort of reminds me again of what the original Steam Machines initiative was all about. And I think the sort of story for me on here is pretty straightforward, right? The 2015 Steam Machines were objectively a failure, right? And yet Valve didn't stop. They continued to develop the idea that, open source operating system, running open source components can actually deliver a viable and these days, in some ways, a lot better alternative to Windows. And to see that actually actualized here today, I think is absolutely fantastic. Okay, Alex, final thoughts?
Yeah, I guess the only thing that I'm lamenting about this beyond the VRAM situation is that it is already an A3. And it feels like there's very few RDNA 4 products, and it's a shame that there aren't smaller chips, smaller GPUs, smaller SoCs that AMD's created that could be leveraging RDNA 4, because we're at this really interesting inflection point in AMD's GPU history where it seems like they're getting on with getting to the future finally, and this is just coming out at maybe the wrong point in time in their product roadmap to not have something more forward-looking on the GPU side. But that is, obviously we have to see this thing running first before I start complaining completely. But, so that's my last 2 cents.
Yeah, I do think affordability was basically one of the prerequisites for the design on this. So, it's no real surprise to me that we're seeing a cutback, what looks like Navi 33, because I don't think AMD actually produced a desktop Navi 33 that was cut back in any way from the
just the 7600, which was 32.
Yeah, that was it. And the 7600 XT, which was basically double the memory on top of that. So, interesting stuff. So it may well be the case that, AMD had a significant amount of chips available that would fit this quote unquote semi-custom requirement from Valve. Even so, though, I guess at this point, it's going to be all about seeing what the machine's actually about. And I guess we're going to have to wait for the review period for that to happen. But thanks a lot for that, Oliver. Really, really interesting stuff. But that's the end of this particular video. So please do like, subscribe, share. If you enjoyed it, ring bells for notifications. Please do support us via the DF Supporter Program, patreon.com/Digital Foundry. And check out our new website at www.digitalfoundry.net, where there shall be a swathe of Valve-related material. But that's all from us for now. Thanks for watching.